The fall of Armie Hammer was as dramatic as his Hollywood career once promised to be. From his breakout roles in The Social Network and Call Me by Your Name to the scandal that nearly erased his existence from Tinseltown, Hammer's descent was swift, brutal, and unforgiving. But now, against all odds and in the face of relentless skepticism, he's attempting a comeback. The embattled actor has recently announced not only a new film project but also a podcast, an intimate, tell-all series that claims to set the record straight about his past controversies. It's a calculated move, part damage control, part public relations gamble, and entirely a high-risk bid to claw his way back into the industry that once embraced him. Yet, Hollywood and the public have long memories, and the allegations of sexual and emotional abuse that surfaced in 2021 continue to cast a long, dark shadow over his every move. Can a carefully crafted narrative, a return to the screen, and a podcast filled with his version of the truth rewrite his story? Or is this just another desperate grasp at relevance in an industry that has already moved on? His new film role, shrouded in secrecy, is rumored to be an independent project, perhaps the only kind willing to take the gamble on a name as tarnished as his. Meanwhile, his podcast, tentatively titled Hammered Truth, is reportedly a raw and unfiltered look at his life, his alleged wrongdoings, and the media frenzy that turned him from Hollywood heartthrob to persona non grata. But is anyone willing to listen? Stay tuned for part 2, where we dive into the details of his latest project and the Hollywood reaction to his attempted resurrection. If Armie Hammer thought Hollywood would welcome him back with open arms, he was sorely mistaken. While the actor has managed to secure a role in an independent film, sources claim that major studios still consider him radioactive. The project, an artsy psychological thriller from a little-known production company, is reportedly being filmed overseas, far from the prying eyes of mainstream Hollywood. Insiders speculate that this is no coincidence. The industry may not be able to outright blacklist him, but that doesn't mean they have to roll out the red carpet either. Despite his best efforts to position himself for a comeback, the whispers in Los Angeles tell a different story. Casting directors remain hesitant, major agents won't touch him, and streaming platforms are reportedly wary of any association. One source described Hammer's return attempt as a car crash in slow motion, with PR experts debating whether he can ever shake off the allegations that derailed his career. His new podcast, Hammered Truth, is set to launch in the coming weeks, promising a deep dive into his side of the story. But will it be a redemption arc or another nail in the coffin? Public response will be the ultimate judge, and Hollywood is watching closely. As news of Armie Hammer's attempted comeback spreads, the public response is as polarized as ever. On one side, die-hard fans insist that everyone deserves a second chance. They flood social media with messages of support, arguing that the actor was never charged with a crime and that the court of public opinion should not be the final judge of his fate. Cancel culture has gone too far, one fan tweeted. If Hollywood can forgive Mel Gibson and Johnny Depp, why not Armie? But on the other side, there's an undeniable wave of resistance. Many are still haunted by the disturbing allegations of abuse, manipulation, and cannibalistic fantasies that surfaced in 2021. The leaked Instagram DMs, the voice memos, the disturbing testimonies, it's all still fresh in the minds of those who refuse to let him return to the limelight without accountability. This isn't just a PR nightmare, a pop culture analyst commented. Hammer's brand is permanently associated with one of the darkest scandals in recent memory. Perhaps the biggest question looming over his comeback is whether audiences will even show up. If the industry fears backlash, and if the general public refuses to watch his new film or tune into his podcast, then all of this, his careful rebranding, his so-called redemption tour, will be for nothing. Publicly, Hollywood remains largely silent on Armie Hammer's return. Privately, the industry is in a quiet war over his fate. Behind closed doors, there are whispers that some powerful figures are discreetly backing his comeback. Rumors swirl that an A-list director, one known for edgy, controversial films, is quietly advising Hammer on how to rehabilitate his image. Could this be a calculated move to position him for a more dramatic return down the line? Or just an old friend trying to throw him a lifeline? Meanwhile, a faction of Hollywood insiders is working just as hard to make sure Hammer never sees another red carpet. Some producers have allegedly blacklisted him from future projects, warning casting agents that working with Hammer is a PR disaster waiting to happen. An unnamed executive reportedly said, "You can put lipstick on a scandal, but people still remember what's underneath." And then there's the question of who leaked that Hammer was making a comeback in the first place. Some sources claim it was his own team, trying to gauge public reaction before making a full-fledged push. Others believe an industry rival exposed the project to spark backlash before it even had a chance. Either way, the chessboard is set, and the players are making their moves. When the first teaser for Hammered Truth dropped, it wasn't just a whisper, it was a thunderclap. For months, speculation had swirled about what exactly Armie Hammer would say in his much-hyped Tell-All podcast. Would he admit to his past? Would he issue a tearful apology? Or would he double down, painting himself as a victim of media hysteria? Turns out, it was a little bit of everything, and then some. The preview, which quickly went viral, opens with a deep, deliberate inhale. Then Hammer's voice, calm, steady, and hauntingly reflective. "You think you know me. You've read the headlines, seen the messages. You've watched as my life burned to the ground. But you don't know the whole story. No one does." From the jump, the tone is set. This isn't just an attempt at redemption. It's a reframe of the entire scandal. The teaser is masterfully edited, slick, brooding, dripping with self-awareness. Over the next 3 minutes, snippets of his voice are intercut with dramatic pauses, almost like the trailer for a psychological thriller. "I made mistakes. Some big ones. But there are things I've been accused of that. Well, let's just say not everything you read was true." Cue the online firestorm. Within hours, social media is ablaze. Critics slam him for using manipulative PR tactics, while supporters praise him for finally speaking out. One viral post reads, "Classic abuser move, control the narrative. Disgusting." Another counters, "He was exiled before he had a chance to defend himself. This is his shot." But it's not just the public reacting, Hollywood is, too. Inside industry circles, the reaction is nuclear. Some believe the podcast is a suicide mission, that no matter how carefully Hammer crafts his story, there's no coming back from what's already out there. Others whisper that it's a calculated risk, one that could actually work if he plays his cards right. And then comes the biggest shock of all. At the very end of the teaser, just before it cuts to black, Hammer drops a cryptic warning. "There are people in this industry who want me gone. They know who they are. And soon, so will you." The internet erupts. What is he implying? Is he about to name names? Is Hammered Truth about more than just his own redemption? Could it be a revenge tour disguised as a confession? One thing is clear, this podcast isn't just about Armie Hammer telling his story. It's about shaking Hollywood to its core. Armie Hammer's podcast was meant to be a controlled, calculated step toward redemption. Instead, with one cryptic teaser, it has become a source of growing anxiety for Hollywood's most powerful players. The moment Hammer hinted that there were individuals in the industry who had orchestrated his downfall, speculation reached a fever pitch. Theories flooded social media, ranging from executives who blacklisted him to former collaborators who distanced themselves at the height of his scandal. Some even suggested that the actor might be implying something even darker, something that stretched beyond his own controversies and into the shadows of Hollywood's long-standing culture of secrecy. The industry thrives on control, but Hammer's vague warning shattered that illusion. The real fear is no longer about his own public perception, it is about what, or who, he might expose. The Whisper network goes into overdrive. Within hours of the teaser's release, Hollywood's behind-the-scenes power players had gone into full-blown damage control. Private discussions erupted among executives, talent agents, and PR strategists, each one trying to assess the potential threat Hammer now posed. The uncertainty of his next move had turned him from an exiled actor into a potential loose cannon. Entertainment lawyers quietly began reviewing past contracts and communications, searching for any connection to Hammer that might resurface in an unexpected way. Talent agencies reached out to their biggest clients, warning them to avoid any public statements that could inadvertently pull them into the controversy. Among producers and studio heads, an unspoken consensus emerged: if Hammer had nothing truly damaging, the scandal would pass. But if he had evidence, texts, emails, recordings, then the industry had a serious problem on its hands. The studio executive's dilemma. At least 2 major studios reportedly instructed their PR teams to begin preparing responses, should Hammer's podcast take an unpredictable turn. While no official statements had been made, a quiet sense of urgency had gripped the industry. The past efforts to distance Hollywood from Hammer were now being re-evaluated, not out of concern for him, but out of fear that those who severed ties might soon be dragged back into the narrative. Streaming platforms, once quick to remove him from promotional materials, found themselves in an uncomfortable position. Some of Hammer's past projects had been quietly buried, while others had merely faded into obscurity. Now, executives feared a resurgence in interest, one that might not just bring back attention to his old films, but also raise questions about the decisions made behind the scenes when the scandal first broke. Hollywood's silent war: who wants Hammer gone for good? Not everyone in the industry is willing to wait and see what happens next. Some have reportedly taken a more aggressive approach, working to discredit Hammer before the first full episode of Hammered Truth even airs. Media insiders have noted a sudden influx of articles and social media posts aimed at reinforcing the image of Hammer as unstable, desperate, and untrustworthy. The goal appears to be clear: if he does reveal damaging information, his credibility must already be so eroded that no one believes a word he says. Some speculate that certain high-profile figures have even reached out to the media to ensure that coverage of Hammer's podcast remains skeptical, if not outright dismissive. Others believe that former colleagues and associates may soon come forward with new claims, strategically timed to drown out whatever revelations Hammer is preparing to share. The battle lines have been drawn. On one side, an actor attempting to reclaim his narrative. On the other, an industry that cannot afford to let him disrupt its carefully maintained image. Hammer's next move, and the unsettling warning that shook social media. Despite the growing backlash, Hammer seems undeterred. In a move that caught even his most vocal critics off guard, he briefly posted a cryptic message on his Instagram story, one that was deleted within minutes but quickly captured by online watchdogs. The simple phrase suggested that he had proof to back up his claims, something tangible that could challenge the carefully curated narratives surrounding him. The speculation that followed was instant and relentless. Had Hammer saved incriminating messages? Was he in possession of confidential emails from high-ranking industry executives? Was his downfall, as he implied, orchestrated by forces much larger than himself? If Hammer truly has evidence, then the question is no longer about whether he can return to Hollywood. It is about whether Hollywood will allow him to speak at all. The release of the first episode of Hammered Truth was nothing short of a media spectacle. Within minutes of going live, it climbed the trending charts, with social media erupting in a frenzy of reactions. Some tuned in out of morbid curiosity, eager to see how Hammer would attempt to justify his past. Others were expecting a desperate plea for redemption, a carefully constructed PR stunt designed to win back public sympathy. What they got instead was something no one had anticipated. From the very first moments of the episode, Hammer's tone was controlled yet eerily detached. There were no scripted apologies, no dramatic proclamations of innocence, and no attempt to elicit pity. Instead, what followed was a cold, methodical deconstruction of the scandal that had destroyed his career, and a series of unsettling claims about what had been happening behind the scenes. The first half of the episode played out as expected. Hammer revisited the timeline of his downfall, detailing the moment he realized his career had collapsed overnight. He acknowledged the leaked messages, the disturbing allegations, and the firestorm of public outrage. What he did not do, however, was offer a simple confession or denial. Instead, he leaned into the gray area, carefully dissecting each accusation while subtly shifting the narrative. Then, the episode took a sharp and unexpected turn. With a measured pause, Hammer introduced what he called the part of the story no one ever asked about. He described the initial days of his exile from Hollywood, the immediate severing of ties by studios, agents, and colleagues who had once called him a friend. But according to Hammer, some of these people had not just abandoned him, they had ensured he could never return. The bombshell revelation came in the form of an alleged industry cover-up. Hammer claimed that, in the midst of his scandal, certain high-profile figures had actively worked behind the scenes to ensure his destruction was absolute. He alleged that powerful individuals had used him as a distraction, a carefully timed media sacrifice to divert attention from far more damaging stories that, had they surfaced, could have implicated some of the biggest names in the business. Without naming names, at least, not yet, Hammer hinted that he had been thrown to the wolves, not just because of his own actions, but because his downfall had been convenient. According to him, major scandals involving other Hollywood elites had been brewing at the same time. But instead of those stories reaching the press, his had been amplified, deliberately stoked by industry insiders who needed to shift the public's focus. The claim sent shockwaves through the entertainment world. If Hammer was telling the truth, it meant that his scandal had not been an isolated event, it had been engineered. By the time the episode ended, speculation had reached a fever pitch. Social media exploded with theories about which stories Hammer might have been referring to. Some pointed to past abuse allegations against high-profile directors that had mysteriously disappeared from the headlines. Others noted that, in the months following Hammer's downfall, there had been a noticeable silence surrounding other rumored Hollywood scandals that had never seen the light of day. The reaction from the industry was immediate. Some dismissed the podcast as nothing more than an act of desperation, a final grasp at relevance from an actor whose career was beyond saving. Others, however, weren't so quick to brush it off. If Hammer had nothing to lose, and if he truly had proof of a coordinated effort to take him down, then he had just declared war on Hollywood itself. A-list celebrities who had once worked alongside Hammer remained silent, neither condemning nor supporting his claims. But behind the scenes, there was movement. Journalists who had covered the original scandal reported receiving sudden, frantic calls from entertainment lawyers warning them to be very careful about how they handled this new narrative. Some media outlets, which had been preparing scathing reviews of Hammer's comeback attempt, quietly delayed their coverage, unsure whether they were about to step into something much bigger than a celebrity redemption arc. And then, in the midst of the growing firestorm, Hammer made another move, one that would escalate the situation beyond anyone's control. As the world debated his claims, he posted a cryptic message on social media. It was just a single sentence, but it was enough to reignite the frenzy. You want names? Stay tuned for episode 2. The fallout from the first episode of Hammered Truth had barely settled before Armie Hammer escalated the situation in a way that sent Hollywood into full-scale crisis mode. His cryptic social media post, promising that episode 2 would reveal names, was the equivalent of lighting a match in a room already soaked in gasoline. Speculation turned into outright panic. Entertainment lawyers, PR strategists, and executives scrambled behind the scenes, each one trying to determine just how much of a threat Hammer truly posed. Some dismissed his words as an empty bluff, a desperate attempt to keep people talking about him. But others weren't so sure. If Hammer had actual proof, emails, text messages, recorded conversations, it could be catastrophic. The industry's coordinated counterattack. Hollywood's response to Hammer's podcast was no longer just reactive, it had become an organized effort to shut him down before he could do any more damage. Within days, multiple articles surfaced questioning his credibility. Suddenly, anonymous sources began leaking new, even more salacious claims about Hammer, as if trying to drown out his version of events before he had a chance to speak again. Some of these new allegations seemed suspiciously timed. Certain outlets, which had largely moved on from his scandal, suddenly reignited interest in old accusations, revisiting his history with renewed aggression. Some commentators even suggested that Hammer was mentally unstable, framing him as a man unraveling rather than a man exposing the truth. The narrative shift was clear: discredit him now, before he could say anything that might stick. A rumor also began circulating that at least one studio executive was working behind the scenes to get Hammered Truth pulled from streaming platforms before the next episode could be released. If that was true, it meant Hammer had struck a nerve in a way that few disgraced celebrities ever had. The growing threat of retaliation. Despite the industry's aggressive attempts to silence him, Hammer showed no signs of backing down. His team remained uncharacteristically quiet, refusing to respond to the media's latest smear campaign. There was no apology tour, no frantic attempts to explain away his statements. Instead, Hammer seemed to be leaning further into the storm. A mysterious countdown appeared on his social media, set to end on the day of Hammered Truth Episode 2's release. The implication was clear: he was prepared to move forward, no matter what came next. But Hollywood had seen this kind of rebellion before. And historically, it never ended well for the person standing against the machine. Some industry insiders began warning that Hammer was putting himself in actual danger. It was one thing to attempt a comeback, it was another to position himself as a whistleblower. If he had evidence implicating people more powerful than himself, then he wasn't just a liability anymore. He was a target. The entertainment world had witnessed similar scenarios before. Celebrities who spoke out against the industry's darkest corners often found themselves facing sudden legal troubles, reputational ruin, or worse, complete erasure. Some had their past scandals magnified beyond recognition. Others saw career-ending exposés mysteriously surface at exactly the right moment. And then there were the stories that never made it to print at all. Hammer's last stand? As the countdown to episode 2 ticked away, whispers of legal intervention grew louder. A powerful Hollywood attorney was allegedly trying to issue an injunction against the podcast, arguing that Hammer's claims could be considered defamatory. If successful, it could prevent Hammered Truth from releasing its next installment, at least temporarily. But some believe that Hammer has already anticipated this. Rumors suggest that he has prepared for the possibility of being legally silenced by handing off his most damning evidence to a trusted third party, ensuring that even if the podcast is shut down, the information will come out. The battle lines are officially drawn. Hammer is days away from either exposing Hollywood's darkest secrets or being completely destroyed in the process. One thing is certain: by the time the next episode drops, Hollywood will never be the same again. The countdown hit 0. The second episode of Hammered Truth was finally live. And within minutes, the fallout was unlike anything Hollywood had ever seen. For days, speculation had reached a fever pitch. Would Armie Hammer actually name names? Would he provide evidence, or was this just another desperate ploy for relevance? By the time the episode finished streaming, those questions were answered, and what came next was nothing short of an industry earthquake. Hammer didn't just expose one name. He exposed several. The exposé that changed everything. The episode began much like the first, measured, calculated, and ominous. But then, about 20 minutes in, Hammer did what many had feared. He started dropping details. He described private meetings, text exchanges, and highly specific interactions with powerful Hollywood figures, actors, producers, and executives, who had allegedly worked to orchestrate his downfall. But the most shocking part wasn't just who he named, it was why they wanted him gone. According to Hammer, his scandal wasn't just a convenient distraction for the industry, it was deliberately engineered to cover up something much bigger. He claimed that, in the months leading up to his cancellation, certain high-profile individuals had been facing their own looming PR disasters, allegations of misconduct, financial fraud, and even crimes far worse than his own. He suggested that his destruction was necessary to ensure that those scandals never reached the public. And then came the part no one was ready for, the receipts. Unlike the first episode, where Hammer relied mostly on his own word, this time, he backed up his claims with documents, emails, and voice recordings. The episode included snippets of conversations where executives allegedly discussed, containing his scandal, references to behind-the-scenes deals where media outlets were pressured to amplify his story while ignoring others, and even a damning recording of a Hollywood agent admitting that sacrifices had to be made to protect bigger names. If Hammer was lying, it was the most elaborate lie in Hollywood history. The fallout, damage control in overdrive. The second the episode ended, Hollywood went into full-blown crisis mode. Publicists scrambled to put out statements denying involvement, lawyers were reportedly deployed to issue cease and desist orders, and industry insiders flooded social media, calling Hammer's claims the ravings of a bitter man. But it was too late. The internet had already seized the story. Clips from the podcast flooded social media, dissected in real time by journalists, influencers, and amateur sleuths. Online forums began digging into the names Hammer mentioned, cross-referencing past scandals that had suspiciously vanished around the same time his had exploded. Some of the people he named had already been rumored to have skeletons in their closets, others had never been publicly accused of wrongdoing before. But now, all of them were under scrutiny. And then came the corporate fallout. Streaming services that had quietly distanced themselves from Hammer were now scrambling to erase any trace of his projects. A major Hollywood studio, one that Hammer had heavily implicated, was suddenly facing renewed investigations into its own history of misconduct. Several high-profile actors and directors who had previously spoken out against him now found their own pasts being dragged back into the spotlight. For the first time in recent memory, Hollywood's cancellation machine had turned on itself. Hammer's fate, martyr or madman? Despite the explosive nature of his revelations, Hammer's own future remained uncertain. His supporters praised him as a whistleblower, a man who had been vilified and sacrificed by an industry desperate to protect its own. His critics dismissed him as a desperate actor throwing others under the bus to salvage his own reputation. And then there were those who believed something far darker, that Hammer's days in Hollywood, and possibly beyond, were now numbered. The industry had seen scandals before. It had witnessed exposés, tell-alls, and moments of reckoning. But never had a disgraced star fired back with such precision, with evidence that threatened to unravel the very system that had exiled him. In the days following the episode's release, Hammer went completely silent. No follow-up interviews, no celebratory posts, no further teasers for the next episode. Just nothing. His last post before disappearing from social media was cryptic, a single sentence. "They should have let me stay forgotten." The final verdict, Hollywood's house of cards begins to fall. The aftermath of Hammered Truth didn't just affect Hammer, it shook the entire foundation of Hollywood. Investigations were quietly reopened. Media outlets that had ignored certain allegations suddenly began revisiting them. Public figures who had once spoken with certainty about his guilt were now facing scrutiny over their own skeletons. Some careers ended. Some reputations were permanently tarnished. Others fought back, launching aggressive counter-narratives to discredit Hammer and bury his story. But one thing was certain, Hollywood would never be the same again. Armie Hammer's career was likely over. But in the end, he had ensured that he wouldn't go down alone.